Okami is an action game with a structure similar to 3D Zelda, but with the addition of rich platforming and fast movement. Our main ability, the Celestial Brush, lets us pause the game at any time to turn the camera into a canvas that we can draw on to affect the world and the enemies within it, and we'll be abusing that for a lot of skips and tricks. This category is New Game Any Percent and involves beating the game from a new file. It's very different from New Game Plus Any Percent, shown at past SGDQs, due to the lack of karmic transformers, which lets that category do an infinite jump pretty much everywhere to cross any barrier. Instead, we have the creativity to use our core moveset to abuse the world's geometry and break the game that way. We also don't have access to carried over weapons, items, yen, etc., which makes the combat and resource management a much more key aspect to this run. And finally, this is the Switch version of the game, but any of the most recent 4 versions, Switch, PC, PS4, and Xbox One, are all equal for this category, since they all have cutscene skips in New Game, which wasn't the case in the PS2 and PS3 versions. After this initial load, we're going to get right started with the tutorial section. You'll notice that Ami has a green trail behind her, and that represents a state we call Dash. There's 2 levels of Dash. There's Green Dash, which you start with by doing a tackle at the start of each map. And the tackle instantly gives you Green Dash, which is 30% faster than just walking, like Ami's base movement speed. And then once you have Green Dash and you dash around for a while, about 5 seconds, you'll get Gold Dash, which is another 30% faster than that. Right here we're getting our first brush technique. So this is the first appearance of the Celestial Brush. We get brush technique from these constellations, and each one is a unique power that lets us affect the environment. This one is Rejuvenation, which lets us restore broken or missing objects. You'll see here I restored the river, and I'm swimming through it by mashing the jump button, which lets me move a bit faster through water, which is very key later on when we have limited breath. One other thing you'll notice with regards to dashing, I'm jumping in and out of things like dialogue triggers and cutscenes, and that's specifically because normally when you hit a cutscene, Ami does a break animation where she loses dash, and to avoid that we can jump into cutscenes, and then we sort of store our dash, and then we can restore the dash by jumping out of the cutscene. And that's what you'll see me doing in a lot of places. Right here you'll notice that I'm using both of the 2 camera modes in this game. There's an inner camera and an outer camera. The inner camera will try to follow behind Ami, so it'll change its angle automatically as you move around. Whereas the outer camera has stays at a fixed angle, which makes it a lot easier to take straight lines. Right here we get the second brush technique. This is Power Slash. This is probably one of the more useful ones, and it's pretty simple. You just draw a line, and you can cut through a lot of things. You'll notice, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is our companion, Isun. He talks a lot. He's a lot more talkative than some other famous pint-sized companions, and he's a lot more lecherous, but that's okay, because we can skip almost all of his dialogue. In general, in this game, skipping cutscenes makes the game a lot more action-heavy. There's almost no downtime longer than 10 seconds throughout the whole run. Although there are some cutscenes that we can't completely skip. So having both of these brush powers, we can now return to the very start area, where we can basically get started with our adventure. The actual adventure going on here is, well, we're playing as the wolf sun goddess Amaterasu in a mission to save the land of Nippon, aka Japan, from evil. And a great evil it is. All of the brush techniques we're receiving from brush gods, who are essentially children of Amaterasu. Or Ami for short. So, having done that tutorial section, we have now partially restored Kamiki Village, which is our starting area. But it's still in a sort of semi-cursed state, where all of the villagers have been petrified. And in order to progress, we need to talk to 3 of the stone villagers. It's sort of arbitrary, but Isun will not let us progress otherwise. You'll notice here I actually don't skip this dialogue, and that happens a couple times in the run where, not necessarily that I can't skip the dialogue, but rather sometimes dialogue is so short that skipping it is slower because skipping has this guaranteed scroll transition where the scroll wipes across the screen. Here we're going to do a quick trick to avoid running around the mountain. This is called Uppy Thingy. I messed it up here, which is unfortunate. But it's quite smooth platforming, and it's our first real trick in the run. If I haven't mentioned it already, we have a double jump, although we don't exactly have it yet, but we can wall jump off walls, which functions like a double jump when it's available. Here's our first fight. I actually skipped 2 fights in the tutorial section, so this is supposed to be the 3rd one, but those were not really worth mentioning since the skips were as easy as walking around the triggers. These enemies were green imps, they're the weakest, and we kill them with 2 power slashes in most cases. Right here we're going to go and pick up a treasure. This is actually a battle item, our first battle item of many. It's called a small exorcism slip, and I'll explain why that's so overpowered later. Here we're going to do a sort of mini-game. This is part of the main quest, technically. We're actually only required to do this much later on, but we can do it right now, which happens to be by far the most convenient time to do it. We just have to dig up all 10 turnips here without Mushi's mom slapping us, or else we'll have to basically reset because it loses so much time. And then we return the oddly shaped turnip to Mushi. I like to call this turnip Mushi's dad. And here's our first example of a cutscene that we really can't skip exactly. So I can't skip this cutscene until someone talks, and this is something that happens in a lot of cutscenes in this game. And unfortunately, Kushi here takes a long time to talk. She just slowly shuffles over to see what we did. But now that she is done, she will give us some alcohol, which I do not recommend doing at home. Do not give your dogs alcohol. And having that, we can run over to our next objective here. There's just a bunch of things to do in the starting area before we're allowed to progress. We talk to this merchant here, and that reveals yet another battle, and this one introduces a new enemy, the Red Imp. It's pretty similar to the Green Imps. We want to power slash it a bunch, but it has a instrument that it can use to block attacks, which we just destroy by power slashing it anyway. And then right here, Isun's going to give us a tutorial for a concept called praise. It's a currency we get from helping people or restoring the world, and we can spend it to improve things like Ami's ink capacity or wallet size, which we will do later, but we're saving that for later because it's actually going to be very helpful to do it at specific times. And right here we're going to introduce one of, I would say, the fan favorite characters. This is Susanoo, the legendary warrior, except he's a total lazybones, and he doesn't want to do his job, so we have to cart him around. Let's just bring him to the big boulder here. We're going to ask him to cut it, but he's going to refuse because he hasn't done enough training. So we run over back to his house, and this time we're going to encourage him to do some training by giving him Kushi's alcohol. So this introduces the first of a few sort of QTE-like segments where we just have to power slash things while Susanoo pretends to slash them. He can't cut these things by himself, so we have to help him out with power slash. But interestingly, this rock we can't cut by ourselves, and it's only through our combined strength that we're able to cut it. So he's not totally a fraud. And each of those QTE segments is always the same pattern, so we have set instructions on what to do each time. I get a bit ahead here because I executed a bunch of things well in this segment, even though I was behind at the end of last segment because I failed Uppy Thingy. Anyway, now we get into our first open area of the game. This is going to be Shinshu Field. You can see this black caviar stuff covering the field. That is the cursed zone. So the curse is a affliction caused by the 8-headed serpent Orochi, and we need to dispel the black caviar by blooming that guardian sapling there, which is A whole bunch of things to explain. Basically, we make the tree pink and then the evil goes away. Unfortunately, we can't do that right now. We need a new brush technique, so we're going to go on a bit of a detour to get that, which brings us to Hana Valley here. Here's one of those cutscenes we can't skip because it's just a camera pan, and no one talks during it, so there's nothing to skip. And then, getting into this is the campfire fight. We used to use that small exorcism slip here because there's 5 enemies, and you'd think, oh, 5 enemies. Wouldn't it be fastest to use it here? Well, not exactly, as it turns out. We can hit multiple enemies at once with Power Slash, and that actually makes it really effective to take these guys out. Something subtle I did there is I deliberately made sure I had full ink when the red imps died. Not exactly when they died, but when their death animation finishes, because that causes any enemy to drop 100 extra yen, which is actually really important for the yen route, because it's super tight early on in this category. Then here we're going to do more dash restores. These are like environmental hazards. They're evil trees that throw fruit at us. But we're just going to mostly ignore them. Some graffiti, because Bowser Jr. decided to get involved in medieval Japanese, not exactly politics. In any case, here's where we actually want to use the exorcism slip, because this fight introduces an enemy called a yellow imp, which is the guy with the big drum there. And, oh yeah, here's I'll explain that later. The yellow imps, they're super annoying to deal with, at least with the tools we have now. So it just saves a ton of time to not have to wait for them to become vulnerable if we just use the small exorcism slip there. The exorcism slip, to actually explain what it does, it's like a screen wipe, but it hits literally every enemy in the battle, regardless of where they are, or whether they're on screen or not. And it does a fixed amount of damage to each of them, which is very handy. Some enemies are more resistant to it than others, but for minor enemies like this, it just ends fights extremely quickly. Unfortunately, they're in very limited supply, so we have to be very conservative with where we use them, especially early game. And that'll become less and less of a problem as we progress. So a lot of the technique in this area has to do with brushwork. Manipulating the brush at the same time as you're also manipulating Ami in and out of brush mode. It's a skill that you have to develop over a long time. It's very easy to do things like lose your dash by making too sharp of a turn after you use a technique like Power Slash. So it's all a bunch of work. Anyway, here's another Susanoo QTE. For some reason there's a bear here. Anyway, this is the ball pushing puzzle. There are like 4 of these in the game, and all of them have unique bad physics. It's a super hard skill to be able to manipulate this thing as smoothly as I was able to do here. I was lucky that this worked out as well as it did. In a lot of cases, the ball just flies off in whatever direction it feels like. But we got it in relatively quickly, which turned out to be a great thing for the time save in this segment. This particular ball happens to be a growth orb which concentrates sunlight power to make trees grow in record time. And this gets us our next brush technique. This would be Bloom. This is exactly the power we were looking for. This makes trees turn pink, burst into blossoms, and that restores order and goodness to the land. Now, going back down Hana Valley, there's actually repeats of both of the fights we did, and we can skip both of them. This one's really complicated, though. Well, not complicated, but kind of precise. We have to do a fairly precise movement in the air at the very edge of the wall there, because the trigger's only barely small enough to move around, and we can't do it on the ground. That there is a cursed patch. So we just draw lines on it, and it restores the grass. We're going to avoid doing that until a fair bit later when we have to. And here's the campfire fight. That was the campfire fight. Yep. A lot of fights in this game work out like that. It's just as easy as running around them. And finally we are back to Shinshu Field to make things right. and dispel the evil black caviar. Here we're going to, next thing we're going to do is make our first shopping trip. So there are merchants throughout this game where you can buy various items based on your progression. Here we're actually just going to buy 2 of a battle item called Steel Fist Sake. It's the orange sake. It's a lot cheaper than Exorcism Slips, and it has a fairly unique effect. It doubles the power of all of Ami's attacks except for Power Slash, which is kind of a downside, but the rest of our attacks are actually quite strong by themselves, and this will be very abusable with the power we're going to get fairly soon. But Steel Fist Sake, it just ends up being a much more cost-effective and efficient way to take out a lot of enemies. Here we're going to start a side quest, the Wanted List side quest, and this isn't technically required, but we're doing this for the tutorial of this side quest, which turns at night. This is also the only place where game language matters. You'll notice I'm playing in Japanese. I actually have to be able to read the name of this enemy that pops up, because it's a random enemy out of a list of 5, and I have to know which enemy I get because I have to cross out the right name on the list. And if I just go by guessing, it takes too long. I actually got hurt during this fight. If you get hit, you lose your bonus on the end screen, which actually reduces the amount of yen you get, which is very bad considering how tight the yen route is in this category, but fortunately it worked out that this is one of the fights that gives less yen, so losing your bonus is less impactful. Once again, we're smashing jump while we swim here to avoid drowning. We can just barely make this one. And this fight coming up here is going to introduce a new enemy. This one's literally just called Dead Fish. Bad name. And just as well, it is a pretty simple enemy to take out. We just hit it with 3 power slashes. One interesting thing about fights in this game, every single way to encounter a fight, you always know exactly which enemies you're going to see. The enemies you get are fixed. However, where they spawn in the battle arena is not fixed. It's random, which results in a sort of RNG factor we just call spread, where if you want to, say, hit multiple enemies with one attack, you would like them to be close together so that it's easier to do. And we had good spread on that fight because all the enemies spawned basically on top of each other, which made it really easy to hit all of them with 3 power slashes. Anyway, here's where we get a very overpowered brush technique. This is Cherry Bomb. We can only learn this at night, which is why we did that side quest earlier. And we'll be seeing a fair bit later exactly why this technique is just so overpowered, but for now we'll leave it as it lets us blow up cracked walls. It's bombs. It's just bombs. And now here, this is going to be our first major skip of the run. Normally right now we're intended to go back to Kusa Village, and that's so that we can get yet another brush technique called Water Lily, which lets us make lily pads on the water, which are platforms that we can jump off of. And that's very handy, because at the end of this tunnel there's a big cliff and there's no way to just swim up it, and you can't jump out of the water. However, as it turns out, we can just jump out of the water, because there's a bit of a glitch in this game called corner jump, where if you swim into certain like acute angles, or like concave corners anyway, in the water, you can, Ami will just automatically jump out of the water, which we can abuse to then get a wall jump off the walls of that cave, and jump and just barely make it onto the cliff so that we can progress straight to Agata Forest. So we've already skipped one of the major brush techniques in the game. Here you'll see I messed up the cherry bomb. That's something that happens a lot when you're trying to draw the techniques as fast as possible, especially the more complicated ones like cherry bomb. Brushwork is once again a skill that you have to develop as a runner of this game. We already have dispelled the black caviar in Nagata Forest, by the way. It's the Guardian Sapling ends up being in a cave directly below where we spawn, so it's really quick to get to if you know where it is. And here we're going to introduce a very important character. This is Waka. In a minute. He's sort of a side character who pretends to get in our way, but is really just trying to help out. Unfortunately for him, he's very vulnerable to explosives, and Steel Fist Sake doubles the power of Cherry Bomb. like I mentioned earlier, which is why these two things in combination are just so overpowered, and we can take them out in just 3 bombs, making quick work. So we get a bunch of money for that. Something I haven't mentioned yet is at the end of each battle, there's that like results screen that shows up. We can make it disappear about a second faster by mashing A or start, where A is the button that makes Ami bark. Yes, there's a dedicated bark button in this game. It's fantastic. So that's why you're going to see me barking at the end of every battle. Here, this is Kakari. We need to help him fish for a salmon, which swallowed the key to Tsuta Ruins, which is our next dungeon. Normally there's a stamina component in these fishing games, but since we only have to do 3 rounds for it, we can just sort of go all in and hold a direction. And then we just press the button. It's a random button that you have to press, but you can just press all 4 face buttons at the same time and get it every shot. For some reason he's fishing without a line, so we have to use rejuvenation to draw the fishing line to the fish we want. There's actually different like sizes of fish, and each size of fish has a random pool of fish it draws from. So the 2 fish we get here are pretty much random, which is kind of bad because we're going to be selling this fish, spoiler, or these fish. And the different types of fish have different sell values. So we want the ones that are more expensive, which makes the yen route more lenient. So here's the big fish. This one's guaranteed. This is the giant salmon. And it is the one that has swallowed the key. So after a fairly long loading zone, we are going to get the key, and now we just have to dash over to Tsuta Ruins to use it. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the loading zones in this game. You'd think that load times would vary a lot between the different platforms, but as it turns out, they don't vary too much. And within any given platform, each individual load zone has a very reliable length. I'm not sure exactly why this happens, but I think each load zone is sort of programmed with a minimum load time, and a lot of these platforms are good enough to just meet that every time. So, if you know what loading zone you're worried about, you can anticipate exactly how long the loading zone is going to be to do stuff. So here's Tsuta Ruins, our first dungeon, and we're immediately going to do a trick. That is Tsuta intro cutscene skip. That skips like an 18-second long camera pan. It's ridiculous. And the trigger for it is huge. We can only barely make it over there. It's very easy to mess that trick up. And we're just going to dash right through. Right here, this is intended to be another required use of Water Lily so that we can make a platform to jump out of the water here. But we can literally just do a precise wall jump, and that makes it over. This is the Bud Ogre fight. Bud Ogre. They're kind of weird enemies in that they're immune to damage right away, and you have to make them vulnerable by going into this state where then you use Bloom, and then you can finally hit them. And ink management is really important here because we only have 3 ink pots at the moment, and that's just barely enough to kill the enemy. This is actually, right here is a ball pushing puzzle. We're meant to go back there and then tackle the ball all the way down the slope and onto a switch to open a door. But we can very fortunately skip this ball pushing puzzle just by drawing a cherry bomb on the switch instead, which is good enough, apparently. And then before it explodes, we can dash through the door. This is the double Bud Ogre fight, I should say. We're going to use a Steel Fist Sake here, and that's specifically to be able to make them both vulnerable with 1 cherry bomb rather than having to do some extra attacks like I did in the first fight. And we can actually use Bloom on both of them at the same time, and then hit them both with another cherry bomb to take them out in only 3 ink pots, and in only 1 cycle, which is extremely handy. Whenever you blow up an enemy with cherry bomb, by the way, their yen flies everywhere, which is kind of annoying. Here we're going to skip having to grow these mushrooms. Normally you use Sunrise to make them into giant platforms, but we can do a very precise platforming, well, not very precise, but fairly precise platforming with a ground tackle into a jump, into a wall jump, into an air tackle wall bounce, and that makes it up that slope. And the segment's fairly vanilla. I actually hold the X button here. This is the fast text button. Like I said, not all dialogue is skippable in this game, but any dialogue that isn't skippable, as long as you're holding the fast text button, which is in this case the X, it'll automatically progress the text at the highest available speed, which is very convenient. So there's only mashing for skip and not for text itself. This is Blockhead. We just have to draw 2 dots on him where the dots show up, which is random. And this gives us a key. Here we can actually do something called an air ground tackle. If you use a ground tackle and then during that ground tackle you slide off of the surface that you're on, you're still in the ground tackle state and you can still cancel it into a ground jump, which is going to be very handy for a bunch of tricks later on in the game, because there's all sorts of cool effects associated with air ground tackles. And here, once again, I actually messed this up. Rejuvenation's kind of weird in that sometimes it'll fail even when you use it properly, because it requires you to cover a certain amount of the area of the thing you're trying to restore. Yeah, so just kind of unfortunate there. I didn't get the camera line up quite right. This is the triple gate room. There are 3 fights here. These are devil gates, by the way. These are sort of static encounters, and every time there's a devil gate, there's always some effect associated with beating it. So there's 3 of them here, so we have to destroy all of them for that effect. Red imps are quite conveniently very vulnerable to explosives, much like a lot of things in this game. Here I unfortunately run out of ink. When you run out of ink, Ami goes into this sort of mortal state, I guess, where she doesn't have the weapon on her back, which is called the Divine Instrument, and you can't use your brush techniques anymore. So it's a lot slower. You also can't dash when you're in that state. You can only walk. Here's where we see how one of the things that makes Trayvon very helpful is that it allows us to destroy yellow imps without the aid of exorcism slips, when otherwise the strategy for defeating them is very slow. And finally here we have a very familiar fight. We have the dead fish and 2 green imps, and here's where the spread becomes a bit of a problem. The enemies are pretty far apart here, so I have to draw a really long line to hit them all with Power Slash, and that is just literally slower. Here I'm going to do a trick where I draw Sunrise as this fight ends, which sort of buffers these 2 cutscenes together. It doesn't have any effect in terms of skipping either cutscene, but it does mean we don't have to do movement between them, which saves time. We actually have to grow these mushroom platforms, unlike the first ones. We're not actually going to use the mushroom platforms, but these poison pots that we have to destroy don't exist until you cut the mushrooms. Or grow the mushrooms, I mean. So we're just going to do a Power Slash within... I messed it up here, actually. We're doing a camera alignment to Power Slash all of the pots while they're off screen. But with just 1 Power Slash, we can hit all, I think, 5 of them. And then there's 3 cutscenes here we have to skip afterwards. But now, Tsuta Ruins is partially restored. It's not fully rid of evil. But now there's actual water here, and we can swim through it. So we're going to go to the center of this dungeon so that we can get the, if it wasn't already obvious, this being very similar to 3D Zelda's, just about every dungeon has a special technique that you get in it, which is similar to getting the items in each dungeon. And spoiler, the enemy's weak point almost always has to do with the brush technique you get. Here we have 3 cursed patches, similar to the 3 devil gates. And we have to bloom all 3 of them. The way these work is you don't actually have to cover them, you just have to put down a certain amount of ink on them, and it restores them. So we just draw circles. And this is our next brush technique. This one is Vine. And it's similar to a hook shot. Basically, we draw a line between Ami and a flower, or the flower and something with a hook on it, and it lets us draw them together. Here we're actually going to set up with a very cool trick. We're going to start with something called a brush adventure. We can actually drag the brush camera around, which lets us stretch it out really far from Ami in ways that aren't originally intended. And this lets us hit this vine which lets us clip through the floor here, and then we can do a tackle out of the vine, which lets us get out of bounds. And in this game, in a lot of places, like multiple rooms in the same area are sort of laid up vertically, so we can fall from one room to a room below it. And in this case, the room below it happens to be the last room before the boss, which saves a ton of time. That trick is actually really hard, and it only saves around 18 seconds because this room is pretty close to the other one anyway. And that trick is actually called Cookie Clip, after Giant Cookie Jar, who discovered it. He discovered a lot of tricks in this run. He's a great glitch hunter. And he thought that one was flashy enough to assign his name to it. That there was a gold gate. It's sort of like a quick save, where if you die, you go back to it, but we do not want to die for reasons I'll explain later. This is our first boss. This is Spider Queen. We just have to do 2 vines to her abdomen, and that opens up her back, which has eyes in it, and then we power slash all of the eyes to cut the eyes open, and that damages her. This is also creepy to describe. And then she's dead, thankfully. And she just sort of vaporizes. And we get a bunch of yen from it. I don't know how, but now that we've done that, we have rescued Ume, who is Kokari's dog, who you'll see, the pink dog here, we're going to be carrying in this cutscene that we just skip. And then we're off. So that's what that was about. So we've already done 1 dungeon, and we have a bunch of brush techniques at this point, and we're going to get a bunch more yet. Right now, we're actually not going directly to the next area, even though we could, because we're taking some time to sidetrack ourselves so that we can get up to a specific area here where there's sort of a fast travel point. It's called a mermaid spring in this game. The mermaid springs are sort of special zones where there's water and then there's like a green swirl, and you can return to it later with tools that we don't have yet. You didn't see it there, and the reason for that is because you only have to get a certain distance within a certain distance around the mermaid spring to activate it, so that you can warp back to it later. And we just get right in that zone, and then we turn right back around, because that's all we're here for. And then we're going to go do this. This is the bridge minigame. We have to draw 6 vines to this bridge. The pattern for it is fixed, so the timing should be consistent each time. But if you mess it up, then it can go a bit longer than what most people know the pattern for. I actually get a bit over-eager here. I start brushing too early, and this is going to sort of mess me up here, where I mess up the vines, and I have to do an extra one. So this minigame, it's sort of weird to optimize. You want to be as early as possible, and you want to draw the vines as quickly as possible, but they're kind of strict on exactly where you have to put the brush to make it work. So it's sort of a battle, time versus consistency. But that gets us over there. It would actually be really nice if we could cross that river without without doing the bridge minigame. It's just barely not possible to cross it, and if you fall into the water, you immediately drown. You get swept away by the currents. It would save like 3 minutes if we could just jump across it, but we can't. It's so close. Anyway, here, this is Taka Pass. It is too afflicted by the black caviar. We're going to get a bunch of supplies here, but not before selling all of our fish for some money. We're going to get 4 meat feed bags, 3 medium exorcism slips, and 3 steel fist sake. So we're getting a bunch of battle items all at once, and we're going to be using every single one of those. There's no like backups here. This is all the very minimum that we need to do the run. We have to destroy this rock. I sort of messed this up. Interestingly here, I run into a wall with Gold Dash. Ami doesn't stop when you dash into a wall, so you can keep Gold Dash after dashing into walls. However, whenever you dash into a wall for more than like a frame, or like 2 frames, you lose your dash internally, which means if you jump and try to restore it, you don't get it. It's just gone. Here's Waka. He's beefed up a bit, so he doesn't go down in 4 Steel Fist Sake Cherry Bombs. He goes down in... he doesn't go down in 3, I should say. He goes down in 4. So he's only a little bit stronger. And fortunately, that's the last time we'll be fighting him. He doesn't get in our way much more. But overall, that was a decently smooth fight, although could have been faster. Cherry Bomb, it'll explode on contact with enemies, but if it doesn't, it has a fuse that takes a while, and usually we try to draw it right on top of enemies so that it explodes right away, but sometimes we mess that up because it's pretty precise. And there, we had to actually wait until he threw his sword into the Cherry Bomb, which detonated it. So we can already see the Guardian Sapling way over there, but unfortunately we can't bloom it from all the way over here. We have to get into some arbitrary range of it, which is kind of annoying. So we deliberately force our camera into the fence here to get it closer to the sapling so that we can bloom it just a bit sooner. Because not only is it dependent on Ami's position, it's dependent on the camera's position too. They both have to be within a certain range of the sapling. So there's a few different times we'll be doing things like that, jamming the camera into the floor or a wall in order to get it closer to where we're looking at. Because normally it follows Ami at quite a distance. Anyway, we're actually, right now, after having bloomed that tree, we're in a sort of auto-scroller state. It's kind of interesting. Blooming the sapling sets the time of day to 5 minutes and 30 seconds before nightfall. And one of the roadblocks we have coming up requires it to be night. So we have to get everything we want done before nightfall in order to do that optimally. But it's actually quite easy to get that done. Usually we'll end up with around 30 seconds of leeway by the end, which results in us just waiting around. Or we could, do fun stuff in that time if we wanted to. So while we're waiting for it to turn night, we want to just get everything done that we have to. So time of day will pass whenever we're moving around. It'll even pass in towns, unlike in, say, Ocarina of Time. However, it will not pass during loading zones. It won't pass during fights, interestingly, and it won't pass during cutscenes or dialogue. So what we're going to try to do here is, we don't really have to care about how optimized our movement is, within reason. But we do care a lot about how optimized our fights and like our cutscene skips are, and our menuing. Because all of those things are going to actually affect our time loss in this segment. So we focus specifically on those just for about 10 minutes. And I did say 10 minutes. So time of day is 5 minutes 30 seconds to nightfall. However, there's so much stuff that we do here that it adds an extra 4.5 minutes on top of that. This fight introduces a new enemy. This is the Blue Imp. This is the only one we'll be seeing for the whole game. We basically just slip it, we use an exorcism slip, we bomb it, we destroy it, whatever, and then we just smack it twice and it dies. This here is Princess Fusei. She is sort of a shrine girl, but she also holds the key to the next dungeon. And it's quite a key it is, because it is not quite as easy to get as the one to Tsuta Ruins. There is a whole segment of the game that is associated with the side quest to get the key here. What we find here is that she has 8 canine warriors that are actual dogs, that are warriors for her. And they've all gone missing, all 8 of her, so she's doing a pretty poor job at the moment of defending her village from evil. So we have to go around finding all of the dogs in the village and feeding them meat, so that they will voluntarily return to Fusei. The thing in the top right there is the canine tracker, which sort of is basically a crazy taxi arrow for the dogs. Shows us where they are. But they're all hiding in wacky locations. The first one was behind a cracked wall in a cave. This one's hiding in a bamboo shoot. And so on. There's lots of other animals you can feed in this game, but we're only going to feed these dogs and one other thing later. Here we're going to do a sort of weird skip. This is one of those skips that emerges from the sort of auto-scroller state, where the only purpose to doing this is to skip a cutscene. It's not necessarily faster in terms of movement, but because we skip a cutscene there, and time of day doesn't pass during cutscenes, we save about 3 seconds by doing that very long vine. The way flowers work in this game is interesting. You can't vine to them from an unlimited distance, similar to how you can't bloom guardian saplings from an unlimited distance. You have to get within a certain range of them for them to open so that you can use them. If you've been counting, we're at 3 out of the 4 dogs here. And then the last one... Oh, I should... That's a bit of a spoiler, right? 3 out of the 4 dogs, so... spoilers, we're not finding all 8 dogs within the village. Some of them are a bit more wayward than others. So this last one was hiding underground in a cursed garden patch. Very claustrophobic. And then Yusun tells us, hey, we found all the dogs. Sort of. So now we're going to go back to Fisei and ask her what the deal is, since there's no more dogs, huh? And there you can see a portrait of a very dog-like figure. This is going to introduce our first dog fight. This is Tei. Much like Waka, Tei, as a dog, is very vulnerable to alcohol-powered explosives. In fact, he's very, very vulnerable, so we just have to hit him with 2 of them and then he dies. Now, dogfights normally don't go this well. There are... I'll spoil it now. There are 4 dogs that we have to fight, just like there's 4 dogs that we have to feed. And each of them has more moves than the last. And they can do all sorts of things, like give themselves super armor and jump all over the place. And it adds a whole bunch of RNG to these fights, where we just want to hit them with explosives. So that they die fast. But that's a whole another thing. In this case, Tei behaved very well. He just stayed in place while eating 2 bombs. And that's that for Kusa Village, which is the name of that area. So we're going to go back to Taka, and still we are waiting for it to turn night. But we have some more things to do. These are things we could have done before going to Kusa Village, but personally I prefer to do them afterwards. It just seems more natural that way. Now this first thing is, if you remember back in Nagata Forest, we did a big detour to activate a mermaid spring. In this case, the mermaid spring doesn't exist yet. We have to go into this devil gate. And then once we defeat this devil gate, the mermaid spring will burst into life. Here's another Bud Ogre. We don't really have any extra tools to deal with it, so we just deal with it the same way we always have. I actually miss a power slash there. I power slashed something in the background, so it triggered anyway, which was confusing. And once again, the yellow imp, the strategy is we have to cover it with ink, which is sort of a secret technique that it's not explicitly part of any of the 13 major brush techniques. If you just draw a vertical line on most enemies, or if you cover them with ink, they'll get into this state where they try to shake it off. And conveniently, that state doesn't have the same armor that the yellow imp's default state does. We can hit it with an explosive. So just take it out really quick. Here we're going to talk to these characters. These are the Molsters. Very unfortunate name. We just have to smack this blue guy 3 times. And these guys move around randomly. It's pretty easy to miss cycles here, but I'm like 80% sure that daytime moves during this minigame, so you don't lose much time. But unfortunately, we got it all in 3 cycles. So the story here is these Molsters, they have stolen this golden teacup from the Tea Master, so we're going to go return it real quick. If you played this game casually, you might not have actually done this. This is technically optional, but it's going to be part of a major sequence break we're going to be doing later. Actually, don't get close enough to the Tea Master here. I accidentally talked to the wrong NPC, which wasted a bit of time, but it's no big deal. So the Tea Master there, in the cutscene that we skipped, he gave us a golden mushroom in exchange for his golden teacup. And that'll come into handy way later. So we'll set that aside. For now, this is the thing that we've been waiting for Nightfall for. This is the House of the Cutters. They are an evil family of demons who live by day as humans in order to capture their prey. So we're actually having about 30 seconds of downtime here, and like I said, you could take this time to mess around, but in an actual competitive speedrun, I just decide to sit exactly where I need to be and just set up a camera angle, because as soon as it turns night, we're actually going to use sunrise to turn it back to day. Sunrise being one of the first powers we got that isn't usually useful for much, but in this case, useful for trains today. I accidentally paused there. That's just some wasted time. It turns night, draw a circle, and we jump into the house right before it turns day again, so that we can still activate this segment. We just drag Miss Cutter here into the moonlight, and she turns into her demon form. It immediately turns day before the fight. And then these are the Cutters. Their true form is as enemies called Crotengu. And we just have to hit them with a medium exorcism slip, and then we tackle them both. The medium exorcism slip actually does kill them. However, depending on the way you kill an enemy, each enemy has like a set of different death animations for multiple ways that they can be slain. And the death animations all have different lengths, so we manually attack them each to turn them into a faster death animation, because their default one is really slow. This here is Chun. This is really what we're looking for. Chun is a sparrow, part of the Sparrow clan, which are just a bunch of anthropomorphic birds that run a bathhouse. Yes, this is very important. This is all very Japanesey. And this is Sasa Sanctuary. This is said bathhouse. We just guide Chun over here. And that lets us into the sanctuary. Otherwise, we can't get in. We can come to here early, but there's no way to get in early. It's technically we're really close to being able to find a skip in. But it only works with an ability that we get later that we can't get before now, which is kind of inconvenient. Anyway, we're going to do a bunch of talking and skipping here. It's one of those cases where there's a bunch of dialogues right after each other. And this is Mr. Bamboo. He's a character we met earlier. But he's going to help us do a digging minigame. So this is an interesting segment. It's sort of a side-scroller. We have to use digging, power slash, or cherry bombs, among other things, in order to guide our charge here, Mr. Bamboo, to the bottom, so that he can help us dig up the water missing from the hot springs. We can power slash him to turn him around. Doesn't hurt him, I promise. No, Mr. Bamboo were hurt in making this video. And we can draw a circle on him to make him run faster. Mr. Bamboo, just to actually explain things, he's a sort of interesting side character. He has an adopted daughter named Kaguya, who is captured by the Emperor of Japan, and is currently imprisoned. We're supposed to rescue her, but we are not going to do that, because that would be slow. And here we get our next brush power. This is one of the major roadblocks in the run. We have to get this one. No way to skip it. This is Water Spout. You draw a line from water to something else, and the water follows it. We can also, in certain spots, we can draw a line straight up, which makes a sort of pillar, which is a rising platform out of the water. Here we're going to use the water to activate a bamboo switch. And that lets us progress further into the back of Sasa Sanctuary. So up this path is the bamboo grove. And we don't really need any bamboo, but we do need something that's in the bamboo. Something interesting about NPCs, if you jump into most NPCs, they will enter this sort of like scared animation, like they're surprised that you're falling from the sky. And that prevents us from talking to them, so we avoid doing that by changing what our falling animation is by using an air tackle. Just an interesting optimization. Here I messed this up. I almost never mess this up. I kind of got distracted, but yeah, this is our next Canine warrior, and he was hiding in the bamboo. This one is Take. The first of the real dog fights, because this one has enough health to survive 3 cherry bombs instead of 2, which actually adds a lot more RNG to the fight. And he tends to jump around a lot, so he's going to start by jumping right towards us. So we draw a cherry bomb where he's going to land, but unfortunately, I miss the mark, and he jumps away from it too fast. There he did an attack where he dashes into us. And here he happens to jump right into my cherry bomb. He does the attack again here. On the startup of that attack, he has super armor, which makes him invulnerable to the cherry bomb. But he loses that super armor as soon as he dashes, which is convenient. And that's that. So, now, what we're supposed to do here is go find the other 2 canine warriors that we have found, all 8 in total, since we're up to 6. And then we would go to our next dungeon, which is Gale Shrine, and then we would, tackle the rest of evil in Japan. However, as it turns out, we now have just enough resources to not do any of that, at least not in the meanwhile. Here, we actually get our first mermaid coin. Mermaid coins are the currency with which we use those fast travel locations that we've been setting in a few different places already. And instead of going to Agata Forest, where the next canine warrior is, we're going to go right back to Taka Pass. And we're going to go to this next area here. So the very beginning of the game, in the cutscenes that we skipped, the like 20 minutes of cutscenes that we skipped, we get a big spiel about how this big bad demon, Orochi, the 8-headed serpent, is going to destroy Japan because some poor sap released him from his 100-year prison. And to cut a long story short, if we did go defeat Orochi, we'd find out that there's actually an even bigger bad that's destroying Japan. And it's supposed to be this big reveal where you think you're done with the whole game, but you're actually only like 1/3 of the way through. And one of the ways they foreshadow that is that they let you visit this area early, which is City Checkpoint. Even though you're not supposed to be able to do anything here until you defeat Orochi. So the way they block you from progressing here is that there's this huge river here, and there's a giant bridge across the river, but the bridge has to be lowered using a technique called Inferno, which is basically the fire equivalent of Water Spout, which we get in the dungeon where we fight Orochi. But we have another way across the river here, and that's with this rock, this very slippery rock. And we can climb up it after just barely being able to swim across the river. And then we do a very precise ground tackle off the tip of the rock, followed by a tackle jump, into a wall jump, into some weird movement, into a air tackle, into an air tackle wall bounce, which gets us all the way up to this ledge, and skips the entire, a huge segment of the early game. It skips the entire Moon Cave and half of Gale Shrine, which saves about 25 minutes off the run. And that skip, that city checkpoint skip, is one of the hardest tricks in this entire game. It's ridiculously hard how precise that is. And I'm very lucky that I got it first try. It normally takes a few tries to get that. Just getting the first ground tackle itself is so precise, and then the way you have to move in the air where you're sort of blinded by the camera is precise. Anyway, here we're going to use another brush adventure. One effect of brush adventures is that we can actually clip the camera out of bounds pretty easily, which lets us do this water spout here. We're supposed to do a bunch of different water spouts to sort of raise the water in stages, but we can water spout directly to the final stage. And this actually has a side effect of letting us act briefly during this cutscene, which, unfortunately, there's no actual way to abuse that, but it's quite convenient. It's a very nice effect. Also, one thing I didn't get to mention, we actually skipped a fight earlier by running into the Curson over that hill. Normally you wouldn't want to go into a Curson since you die if you stay in there too long, but we can make use of that effect. Having done that anyway, I gotta quickly explain interior clips. Basically, the interior of houses in this game are, like houses and buildings, are stored physically below the exterior map. This means that if we could clip out of bounds, we could fall directly into a house. And that's exactly what we do here. There's a tiny hole in the collision by those stairs, and we can fall directly into the dojo here, which we do. And the dojo is actually quite small. It's pretty easy to miss the dojo and just like fall into the void, and then you have to do the trick again. But we can use the overlay map to line ourselves up with an icon on the map, and that lets us get it every time. And then here we're going to learn the only required technique in the game, which is double jump. And it's very handy, as you can imagine. With all the skips we've been able to do with just a single jump so far, imagine what we could do with a double jump. Yes, it's very sick. So, very convenient that we can get this relatively early in the run. That's actually, that clip that I did earlier is actually one of the only times we can outright do, like, clip through geometry in this game. The collision physics are extraordinarily robust, and it's very hard to just outright clip through a wall. In addition, every single wall in this game, invisible or otherwise, is double-sided, except for floors and ceilings, which means that if we clip out of bounds, it's also hard to clip back in bounds in a lot of cases. So overall, it's just really hard to find clips. So usually when we're trying to get out of bounds, we're going to try to go over a collision rather than through it. Here we do an interesting skip. Skips a really big fight trigger with an enemy called an Ubume, who's just a huge pain to fight. And this brings us to Saeon City, the capital of Japan. So Saeon is home to a horrible plague that the country's leader, Queen Himiko, is utterly failing to respond to. Very, very prescient for a game released in 2006. This is also home to the Gauntlet, my affectionate name for a series of tricks that we do starting here. Here we do a precise jump to get onto this very slippery collision, and then we can do a bunch of movement with our double jump and our air tackle bounce, which gets us enough height to land on the collision, and then we can clip out of bounds. So this is one of those times where we're going over an invisible wall rather than through it, and this lets us get out of bounds to do an interior clip. This one's actually really important. In case... So this particular interior is the restaurant. Normally we cannot access this restaurant until we've cleared the plague in Saeon, which, if it wasn't already obvious, we have no intention of doing that since it takes a bunch of time. So instead we do an interior clip, and that lets us get into the restaurant way early, and we give this dude the golden mushroom that we got from the Tea Master in Taka Pass, and he gives us Fire Burst, which is technically an optional brush technique. I mentioned before that we skip Inferno, which is the fire equivalent of Water Spout that we get in the Moon Cave, where we fight Orochi. But there is one check in the game where they make sure that you're able to melt stuff with fire. Very conveniently, there's an alternate way to melt stuff, which is with this sort of upgrade to Fire Burst, or to Inferno that you're supposed to get, which is Fire Burst, that lets you make fire without a fire source. But also very conveniently, the way Fire Burst is programmed and all other optional brush techniques is that they're actually unique brush techniques internally, which means we can get it without having the base technique. Here we do a very interesting platforming skip. We do a ground tackle here off the slippery surface. I actually messed it up here since I didn't get enough momentum. I mentioned before that if you do a ground tackle off a slippery surface, you can still do a ground jump in midair. And one interesting thing about that is that you can actually transfer the momentum of sliding off of a surface into the ground tackle, which lets you get extra distance. And that's enough to let us get onto this raised bridge. In order to... Normally you have to lower the bridge, which is done by first doing a digging minigame to restore the water, and then you have to do a fishing minigame, and that's just a big pain. Here is Rao's skip. We are supposed to meet the Priestess Rao, but she talks a lot, so we don't want to talk to her. So we just go directly around her building. And then finally, this is an area we're also supposed to be locked out from. This is Himiko's palace. We're supposed to do a whole dungeon, which is actually preceded by a whole mini dungeon, in order to get into here, which we do by getting a power that lets us slow down time, which lets us sneak past the guards. We're not going to do that. That power is Veil of Mist, and we never get it. As it turns out, we can just bite the guards to drag them back and then tackle into them, and then we can just sneak past them with by sort of stacking the cutscenes together so that the second one where they throw us out can't trigger. And then finally, we arrive at the hardest trick in the run. If you've played this game, you'll know that among the various things that we've already skipped to get into this palace, there's an item called the Lava Tablet, or the Fire Tablet, I should say, which lets us swim through lava, and for some reason, Queen Himiko has elected to fill the second floor of her palace, specifically, with a huge sea of lava. And, yeah, if we fall into that, we will not die exactly, but we'll respawn where we jumped from, which would be bad. And the gap is really, really big. And there's a bunch of ceilings where if you jump into the ceiling, you immediately lose all your speed and you'll just fall into the lava. But as it turns out, it's just barely possible to jump all the way across the lava. And the way you do that is with basically 4 frame-perfect inputs in a row in terms of jumping and releasing jump to make sure you don't jump too high. And then doing an air tackle at the end. And there's 1 frame of leniency across all 4 of those inputs. You saw I was doing a bunch of stuff with the brush there, and that's specifically to sort of buffer out the inputs and make position setups and stuff. but you can't actually brush, you can't like do pause buffers in this game exactly. The brush buffer only allows you to advance 2 frames at a time, and most of those inputs are frame perfect, which means the brush buffer only lets you get the timing. It doesn't let you actually get the timing for free. You still have to do a frame perfect input. You just don't have to it's you just have to buffer forward a few frames at a time and you get it. We actually have to do the jump in backwards as well, because we can't like save and quit in this game in order to get out of areas. As it turns out, the reverse jump is way easier than the forward jump, which thank goodness that we don't have to do fire tablet skip twice each time. Anyway, what happened there while I was explaining that very, very tough trick, again, to be clear, we for a long time thought that trick was going to be TAS only with how hard it is, and then I just, the Japanese runner Tsunakan, who held the record before I took it, he was the first person to decide, hey, I'm going to grind this out, I'm going to do this in runs. Oh, say hi to Rao here. This is Lady Rao, and that's the last time we're going to be seeing her for a very long time. Anyway, so Tsunakan started doing fire tablet skip and runs, because he's insane, and he did it with like no setups. And then I decided I'm going to work harder and not smarter, backwards. Smarter and not harder. So I developed all the setups, but the trick is still insanely hard, and so it's very easy to lose a lot of time there just by trying it over and over. Like, you grind that out specifically, not with the intention of getting it first try, with the intention of getting it within like a minute or 30 seconds or something like that. That's your goal. So anyway, when we were talking to Queen Himiko, rather than helping her people who are afflicted by plague, we're actually already supposed to have dispelled the plague by now, so she doesn't think it exists. She's in her own world. So instead, she gives us a border key and tells us to go talk to the people who live underwater, because she has some business with them, because apparently they control the water dragon, and the water dragon is preventing the ships from getting to Saeon City, which means no one's getting their Amazon Prime, and obviously that's a huge disaster in a time of plague. Anyway, so this is North Ryoshima. We skipped a bunch of things to get here, but Waka there is still going to call us slow for not getting here sooner, because this is actually the first area we found which is not afflicted by the black caviar, and that's because Waka took it out for himself. He saved us the time, which is very nice of him. Once again, an enemy quickly dispatched by the medium exorcism slip. So, in order to get to the dragon people, we have to take a bunch of side stuff. Here we do our first shopping trip since Taka Pass. We're going to buy some mermaid coins and a feed bag, as well as some extra steelfish sake, which we'll be using. That's all the steelfish sake we'll be needing for the rest of the run. Here we do something similar to what we did in Nagata, where we run towards a mermaid spring just to activate it and then immediately turn around, because we're going to be warping back here much later. Then here we're going to run all the way to this guy here, Urashima, and we ignore him. We just need to talk to him once for some reason, it's weird. And then we just barely make it before it turns night so that we can turn it back to day, and for some reason this summons Orca, the envoy of the Dragonians, the underwater people I was describing earlier, and he's our taxi. He's much faster than swimming, and unlike swimming, he is not vulnerable to the water dragon, who would try to eat us if we swam normally. Much like swimming, however, we have to mash the jump button in order to make him go faster. And the place we're going faster to is Catcall Tower. Catcall Tower is this enormous tower, at the top of which is a cat. Unfortunately, Catcall Tower is a separate area. We can't do something like interior clip to the top of it, which is very depressing. Anyway, we start here by skipping a fight. At the very entrance here is supposed to be a fight with an enemy called a poltergeist, but we can just barely jump around it. This is once again one of those times where I made the trigger a bit too small. So I take a little while to set that up, but it's a pretty simple trick. And then we have to jump. This is 2 minutes of jumping, and it requires about 200 jump inputs overall. It used to be that we had to just press the one jump button we have, the B button, over and over in a very specific rhythm in order to jump up here. We can actually jump on the walls here because they have these yellow marks on them. I'll explain it later. So it used to be that we had to press jump 200 times, which is a workout for the thumbs. But the recent Switch firmware update added button rebinding, which means we were able to bind one of the buttons we don't normally use, one of the shoulder buttons, ZR, to jump, which sort of lightens the load a bit, so we can alternate between the B button and the ZR button to make it easier to do this jump. You can actually do a tackle to move sideways up the tower here, which is very convenient. And we deliberately land on the platform here. That's because if we get this dialogue option from Isun, which happens whenever we land on one of these platforms, we won't get a cutscene at the top where you're supposed to get a reward for doing it in one try. As it turns out, the cutscene at the top is 4 seconds long. Skipping Isun is 2 seconds long, so we do that instead to save time. But yeah, overall, this is a whole big thing. And finally, we're at the top. Yay, we made it. Here we're going to do some jumps over this spiral staircase. Believe it or not, this was only discovered like a couple weeks ago that you could do this and that it saves time. This is one of those tricks that probably should have been discovered in like 2012. But yeah, we're slow on some things in the Okami speedrunning community. And here's a cat, a very adorable cat. I love cats, even more than dogs, but we play as the dog in this game. And we have to feed the cat. We run right towards it, which scares it, but we can feed it before it runs too far away. And for feeding this cat at the top of this incredibly tall tower, we earn favor from the gods. And that earns us another brush technique called Catwalk. And Catwalk lets us make those yellow wall markings anywhere there is a cat statue, specifically. So these cat statues, we've seen them in a couple places already, but now we can finally interact with them, and that lets us climb up walls that normally would be too tall to, say, jump up. And it's kind of unfortunate. This power is actually the kind of power that we could skip. There's nowhere in the game where it hard checks that you have it. You're just implied to have it by being able to jump up certain ledges and such. But unfortunately, there's only 3 required uses of it, and none of them we're particularly close to being able to skip. There's one where we're sort of on the edge, where it might be possible with maybe some task-perfect tricks. But even that, it's not really worth looking for at the moment, because the other 2 are so much harder to skip. But anyway, we're pretty far off the beaten path here. We did a bunch of sequence breaks, and we got sort of distracted. What we're supposed to be doing earlier is finding the Canine warriors, and that's what we're going to do now. So this is why we activated the Nagata Spring. It's so that we can return here now. So this is what we were supposed to do, getting the dogs. And here we have a cutscene with Susanoo. This might not seem like it's related to finding the Canine warriors. It's not. It really has nothing to do with it. But for some reason, the way the scene is laid out, you literally cannot do the thing that lets you encounter the next Canine warrior until you've done this, which is supposed to be something you're meant to do as a precursor to getting to the Moon Cave, which is why they require you to do it. But like I said, we're not going to the Moon Cave. So we're just going to abuse the fact that we have double jump here to make this platforming a bit easier, so we don't have to swim. And we're going to dash over to a familiar face, familiar place, Kokari. So once again, Kokari is having some fishing trouble, and that happens to be because this time a fish swallowed something a lot more important than a dungeon key. It swallowed his actual dog, the one we rescued earlier. Kokari is not a very good owner, but this does give us the opportunity or burden of doing another fishing minigame. So once again, we have the random fish. Fortunately, by now it doesn't matter as much. We've practiced, or we've passed the pinch points for, well, the important pinch points for yen in this route. This fish was really breaking my ankles. They can turn randomly, and if they turn, then suddenly they won't, you're pulling in the wrong direction. So you have to watch carefully, and they can really mix you up. And this time, the big fish is not a salmon. It is our favorite Burger King meal. It is the Whopper. Don't ask me why it's called that. And this one is actually a very healthy fish. Very big one. Because it takes 2 power slashes instead of 1 to destroy. But we got it. We got it. So in the cutscene we're about to skip, it coughs up our good friend Ume. And in addition to coughing up Ume, it coughs up the reflection of the moon off the surface of the lake. Yes, really. He ate the moon. And that gives us another constellation, which gives us another brush technique. This one is Crescent. It is the nighttime equivalent of sunrise. Strangely, this is like... It's weird. Remember earlier that we were locked into a cycle where we were waiting for it to turn night? It would have been very convenient to have this power then. But there's no time after that where we actually really care. Although we will be using it. I should give it that much credit. Yeah, so here's another dogfight. We will be using Crescent again. But it's very strange. We could, in theory, skip it, but you automatically get it for doing this dogfight. And there's no way to skip the dogfights in this category. So we just have to give Ume a taste of the old gunpowder. And off he goes. So this fight is overall very similar to the Take fight we had earlier. Ume has a couple extra moves, but we didn't see them there. We just saw Ume jumping around a bit, which is suboptimal, but that's RNG for you. So, having found 7 of the 8 Canine warriors, we are going to go back to our roots, take care of some old business, and we're going to head back to Kamiki Village for the first time since we left at the start of the run. We take a bit of a shortcut here. There's actually 2 entrances to Nagata from Shinshu, but the upper one is not normally accessible from below because there's a big ledge you have to jump down. So we just jump down there, and we're just going to go straight to Kamiki. So yeah, if you've watched the New Game Plus any % run, you'll know that they don't do the dog quest at all because they're able to skip it. That is something we don't have the opportunity to do here. Here, Isun actually gives us an interesting dialogue trigger. He is asking us to go see some attractions in Shinshu Field, because at the very beginning of the game, you're supposed to visit a bunch of different landmarks there, and explore before you go back to Kamiki Village to get Water Lily, which is the first power we skipped, the first technique we skipped. But the dialogue never disappears, so we still have to say no here for him to let us into Kamiki. And here's the last dog. Here's Hayabusa. So Hayabusa is the reason that we did the turnips at the beginning of the game. We dug them all up. Because he literally will refuse to fight us if we have not dug up all the turnips, because apparently he was the turnip holding record holder. This fight is actually a bit different from the other ones because there's these grass patches here, and when you blow them up, you get vegetables. And the vegetables have text boxes, so you don't want to pick them up, which slows things down quite a lot. And I picked up 2 vegetables, which is suboptimal, but that's just how it is. You can actually abuse the grass patches there, because if you put a cherry bomb in a grass patch, it'll blow up right away rather than having to wait for the fuse or for Hayabusa to run into it. But I didn't get the chance there. It requires him to jump towards the grass patch in a certain way. So yeah, finally, we have talked to all of the Canine warriors. We have obtained all of their power orbs, which are the things that hang around their necks. And now all we have left to do is return to Kusa Village. So you might be asking, well, what's this all for? Why do we have to do this side quest at all if we've already skipped past it in the game? And the reason for that is because, like I said way back in Tsuta Ruins, each dungeon has a signature brush power which you use to defeat the boss. However, this game is also pretty good about checking if you have certain brush powers later on. And one of the brush powers we just have no way of skipping happens to be the one you get in Gale Shrine, which is, we'll mention it when we get there. Here we're actually going to do another Devil Gate, and this one is specifically to open up the Shinshu Mermaid Spring, which we could have done way earlier in the game. It just happens to be faster to do it now. because of some interesting ways that certain tutorial dialogues work out. So we just take care of this really quick. These are some early game enemies, so we take care of them the same way we've taken care of them always. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten any stronger. Technically, each boss you defeat gives you a new weapon, and we did defeat one boss already, which is Spider Queen. We did get a new weapon. However, it happens to be that there's no point where that weapon actually matters, since we use our brush techniques and our battle items to defeat enemies so often. So we're still using the weapon we got at the very beginning of the game, which is called Divine Retribution. All of the weapons in this game have fantastic names, by the way. The other weapon we have is called Snarling Beast, but we have no need for it. It's just not enough of an advantage to be worth the time to do the menuing to equip it. So yeah, having done the Mermaid Spring, we can warp to Taka Pass, and then we just have to run all the way up this path, this very long path to Kusa Village. One thing that we have now that we're not supposed to have now is double jump. We have it a lot earlier in the game than we're supposed to, which is quite convenient because it's going to let us do some very minor time saves here in terms of just the path to get up to where we need to be. What we need to do is we need to go all the way to the back of the village again to talk to Princess Fusei, the one who told us to find the Canine Warriors in the first place. Because she is the one who has the remaining power orbs to form the key to the Gale Shrine. One minor interesting thing here is that when we talk to Fusei, we don't actually have to jump into her dialogue, unlike most NPCs, because talking to her automatically stops Ami in place rather than forcing her through the braking animation, which means we can store our dash without jumping into it. Very, very minor detail. It comes up in a couple other places as well. No idea why that happens. I think it has something to do with the fact that we get these power orbs here that are orbiting around us. This is the key. It also has some other things that it's supposed to do in the boss fight, but we're not going to do the boss fight if it wasn't already obvious. The only thing we're here for is Gale Storm. And this is the entrance to Gale Shrine. In the New Game Plus Any % run, you can actually do a trick that lets you warp from this area to the actual main area of the dungeon. Unfortunately, there's just no way to clip out of bounds without an infinite jump in this area. Which is kind of fortunate, actually, because technically speaking, if it was possible, it would be possible to do that skip in New Game. But it would require doing like a dozen frame-perfect jump inputs for reasons that are difficult to explain. It would be basically TAS only, and it would be so stupid if anyone ever tried to do it in a run. Because if anyone ever got in a run, then no one would ever be able to match the run again. This is the first new enemy in a while. This is a Chimera. It's pretty simple. It's similar to the Dead Fish, which takes 3 power slashes, except the Chimera takes 3 cherry bombs instead. It has this sort of counterattack where it sprays water everywhere. One thing that happened there, you saw that a third cherry bomb blew up. However, a lot of enemies have this sort of invulnerability period after they get hit. If you hit them again too soon, they won't take any damage. And I kind of got unlucky there. I drew the third cherry bomb too soon after the second one blew up. So I had to draw a fourth. This spawns another key. We haven't seen a key in a while. I actually really screwed up the movement to pick up the key. That was my fault. Interestingly, we can toss the key here, if I will. Oh, I actually think I don't do it. I forgot to toss it. But just to finish my thought, if you toss the key, it'll respawn in your mouth when it despawns after a few seconds, which means if there's a long distance between the key and the door, we can toss the key early so that we can bark on the way to the door. Just a very minor swag strat. This is an explosive powered elevator. Very annoying. Not cool at all. And this is yet another Chimera. I mess up the cherry bomb a couple times here, I think. And once again, because we blew up the enemy, we have to run around to pick up all the yen. I'm actually going to jump into the wall here, which makes the camera freak out. There's no point to that. The cutscene here respawns on me in a specific position anyway. This is actually something a few different cutscenes in the game do, where they warp you around, which is going to actually come in handy in a certain spot much later, at the very end of the game. We call those cutscene warps. We actually have seen a couple already, like when we bloomed the Guardian Sapling in Ryoshima. Once again, my cherry bombs were kind of sloppy here because I was kind of nervous for how much time ahead I was. But yeah, that breaks the second lockjaw. One interesting piece of trivia: there's no point in this game where you have access to two keys at once intentionally, which creates this interesting side effect where if you do get access to two keys using glitches or tricks, if you bring the wrong key, like an early key, to a later lockjaw, a later locked door, it won't work. The lockjaw will pretend to be scared of it, but it will not explode. Here we have to draw opposite shaped wind to the black wind that we see in order to counteract it and dispel the evil spirits. And that unveils another constellation, and this is Gale Storm, like I said earlier. This allows us control of the wind by drawing loops and spirals and such. And it is not really a particularly helpful brush power in any way other than that there's a couple hard checks for it in the run, where there's just no substitute. We have to get it. And one interesting thing about having double jump this early is that we can actually use it to get out of bounds in a way that's not possible without double jump, which lets us jump or fall out of bounds here all the way to this bridge, which happens by pure coincidence to be located directly under the viewing platform there. And that saves like 20 seconds of escaping the dungeon. Because guess what? We are escaping the dungeon. We are not going to fight Crimson Helm. Interestingly, in English, right here, Isun's going to give us a dialogue which would say, we can't just ignore Crimson Helm forever. And then you have to say, okay, I'll come back later when you leave the dungeon. But we're not coming back later. We will, in fact, ignore Crimson Helm, if not forever, at least for a very long time. So that's just kind of funny to me. That's why that split is called Ignore Crimson Helm. And so, finally, we have now taken care of pretty much everything that is blocking our progression. We have Gale Storm, we have all of the other brush techniques that we need, and at this point, it's just a matter of forcing our way through the rest of this arc of the game. So we're just going to go right back out of Kusa Village. There's unfortunately no way to fast travel from Gale Shrine to anywhere else. At least not in this category. So we're going to go all the way back to the Mermaid Spring in Taka Pass. And if you remember, way back in North Ryoshima, before we summoned Orca and went to Catcall Tower and did all that nonsense, we activated a Mermaid Spring, and that is exactly where we are going to go next. So this avoids having to do city checkpoint skip twice, because we can warp from one side of the Great River to the other. The Great River sort of divides the game world up into these two halves. So here we are in North Ryoshima, and we actually have to do another shopping trip here. We would have liked to be able to buy all this stuff all at once earlier when we went to this merchant, but we didn't have enough money yet, and there's some specific expensive stuff we need to buy. Namely, we need these 3 exorcism stuffs, and we actually need a healing item here, a holy bone. This will heal 3 units of solar energy, which is sort of our hearts in this game. And there's a specific reason why we need that. We're not actually like worried that we're going to get hit by enemies or something. No, quite the contrary. And I'll explain why we need that when we get there. But it is very critical that we have that bone. It is necessary for the run to work at all. Here we're going to skip a fight by jumping onto this wall. And then we do another big jump. And then for this guy, we have to get close to him and then draw a star. This is the Watcher. He's making a wish on that shooting star. And his wish happens to be that the Spiral Galaxy appears. Or the Whirlpool Galaxy, I should say. And then we gotta run up to this gate so that we're close enough to the galaxy. Yes, this, we're gonna explain. Then we gotta use Gale Storm. And we gotta use Gale Storm 3 times. And once we've used Gale Storm 3 times, the Spiral, or the Whirlpool Galaxy will spin fast enough such that it opens up the whirlpool here in the Sea of Japan on Earth. And that is the portal to the Dragon Palace. That is how we get to the bottom of the ocean so that we can talk to those people who are preventing everyone from getting their Amazon Prime. And unfortunately, we can't just jump into the whirlpool. We have to go get Orca, because he is the envoy of the Dragonians. But yeah, if you're an astronomer, please don't freak out. This is just mythology. They didn't know how it worked back then, so you know, we got some crazy shit going on. We're blowing wind in order to make the galaxies spin. Actually, slip off Orca here. It's kind of annoying. You can only get onto him if you are on him. And then we just press B to go fast. So this finally, after this loading zone, is going to bring us to the Dragon Palace, home of the Dragonians. And the Dragonians are led by a queen, Otohime. And the long story short is that the water dragon that has been eating everyone's Amazon Prime is in fact the husband of Otohime, but transformed into a massive dragon for some reason. And he is freaking out because he's, I guess, possessed by evil demons or something. So we need to go deal with that. So Otohime is going to ask us here to do a hit job on her husband. Because I guess it wasn't a very happy marriage, considering her husband, you know, was very busy with work. Being a dragon and all. We actually have to do... The dialogue there is kind of mean. They pulled a Kepra Gebra, where the first dialogue is, yes to repeat me. No if you want to actually, you know, progress. Get to the rest of the game. So we have to deliberately pick the other option. But anyway, now that we've talked to Otohime, we can now go here. And as it turns out, the water dragon is just sleeping in this hole here. He sleeps very bizarrely. Sleeps with his mouth wide open. So we're just going to jump into his nose. And now we are within the water dragon. Believe it or not, this is actually only the second time in the game that you're intended to go inside another living creature. But we skipped the first one, thankfully. The first one being, of course, the Emperor of Japan. Not Queen Himiko, the Emperor. Entirely separate. Here there's some blue scrolls. These will chase you regardless of the time of day. Normal scrolls outside of dungeons will only chase you when it's night. But we have a very narrow space to move around there, so it's very easy to accidentally get hit by them, which starts a battle, and then you can escape from the battle without completing it, but it still wastes a bunch of time. So it's handy to be able to move around them. The way scrolls work is that they sort of have like an aggro range where they won't step outside. It's sort of like their home. And if you step inside that range, they'll chase you, and then if you step outside, they'll stop. But you can sort of abuse that by jumping into the range so that you enter it from like the middle. It's kind of weird. Right here, if you've seen a New Game Plus run, I keep saying this, but this is one of the only tricks that was patched besides the Karmic Transformer infinite jump glitch. You used to be able to just use water, like regular water spout from outside this room to break up that orb, which is the water orb, the secret to the water dragon's power. But instead we have to do it the vanilla way since they patched it. Mean old developers. And in order to do that, we have to release the stomach acid by using water spout to draw stomach acid into this membrane. This is a very, very cruel hit job. This guy's gonna have a massive stomach ache. So having done that, the acid is now released, and the room is filled with acid. So here's the key thing. This acid is acid. It will constantly hurt you as you swim through it. So not only you have limited breath, you have limited health. And as it turns out, your health drains actually faster than your breath does. And we don't have enough health to swim all the way through. And that's exactly why we bought the Holy Bone at the merchant earlier. So we can use it at the last second to refresh our health. And then on top of that, we're actually going to expand our wallet, which we only do because it happens to be convenient to do those two menus at the same time. And then we just hit this thing 3 times, and that unveils the evil spirits. These are the tube foxes. These are the proverbial frogs in the water dragon's throat. And there are 8 of them. They come in 3 phases, 3, 2, and 3, and each phase just goes down with a large exorcism slip. This is the first time we're using them, I think. Yeah, the exorcism slips, like I said, come in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large, and they're all the same. They all are screen wipes, but they do progressively more and more damage, which makes them progressively more and more overpowered. But they're also more and more expensive, which means we have to really conserve our large exorcism slips. Or we would, if not for the fact that by this point in the game, they think you're supposed to have a lot of money, so they give you maybe a bit too much money for some things we're going to do later. Here the water falling from the ceiling is actually completely random, and it can hit us while we're jumping through the air there, which completely cancels our momentum and makes us fall into the water, which wastes like 10 to 20 seconds. It's super annoying. But we got lucky here, and we didn't get hit by the RNG acid. So this was a fast escape from the dying water dragon. So now that we have the water orb and the water dragon is dead, everyone can get their Amazon Prime, and then the water orb happens to be a shipping tracker, I guess we'll call it. And so we're going to go return that to Orihime, which she'll be able to use for other purposes. So now what is revealed is that the Rao that we saw for like 5 seconds way at the beginning of the game, and or not at the beginning, like the middle of the game, we skipped over her dialogue and then we ran directly past her. So you might have missed it even. Basically, Rao, the priestess, is being chased by an evil spirit and we have to go rescue her. Oh no. Unfortunately, during this segment, the game doesn't let you use fast travel, which could speed this up in theory, at least for certain other categories. But we just have to take the on-foot route, or on Orca in this case. So this segment is pretty simple, just going to be running all the way through, all the way to Ryoshima, and then to from North Ryoshima to regular Ryoshima coast. We can't directly enter Saeon here because this is a moment of crisis and the border is closed. Something. These are horses. Not helpful. They can actually get in our way a bit. The fight trigger from the Ubume fight that we skipped earlier is actually still here, so we need to be kind of careful that we don't jump into it, which we could do, and it would waste a bunch of time. So thankfully it's pretty easy to just take a berth around it. And we're trying to take a clean line here because there's not much else we can do to really optimize this particular segment. We just run across the whole map basically. And here we're going to take a sort of side route up to Ankoku Temple, and this skips a bunch of cutscenes with the spirit of Rao. Because, spoilers, Rao, the real Rao, has already died. Ooh. And we only catch this very last cutscene here, where Rao disappears into this cliff face, which destroys some collision, which lets us get into this tunnel that we're going to see right now. There we go. So there's a well here, and then we jump into the well, and there's a tunnel, Interestingly, this tunnel happens to be an interior of Saeon City, which means if we build a dash here, we can store it into actual Saeon, which is just a very tiny optimization. And now we're at Himiko's palace. So guess what? I remember earlier when I did Fire Tablet Skip, and I made a big stink about how it was by far the hardest trick in the game, and it required a lot of frame perfect inputs, and that it's so hard that you don't expect to get it consistently. Yeah, we have to do it a second time, because they do not remove the lava once you've proven that you can cross it. They don't give us an easy way out here. We just outright have to jump across it twice. The only difference between this and the first skip is that there's not a text box to clear while we set it up, so we can just jump right into this position setup, which gives me more of an opportunity to explain how this works exactly. We have to line up Ami's paws as we fall. I actually almost got a first try skip here, but I did too high of a jump for the double jump, which resulted in me hitting the ceiling and losing all of my speed, so I just fell into the lava. So yeah, we set up the camera here, we jump into the corner that the doorway makes, and that lets us get a consistent position, but it's not exactly the right position. So we adjust the position by waiting till we fall. As we fall, we try to catch a certain frame using the brush, and then we hold up on the analog stick, and then let go of brush, and that means we start moving forward at a consistent point, which happens to give us the right position to make the trick possible. Because as it turns out, not only is this trick frame perfect for to start the first jump, it's also, if you just run at it, there might not actually be a frame where it's possible to get it, because you might be too far from the wall to make it, or from the edge to make it one frame, and then the next frame you've already hit the invisible wall that surrounds the platform, which means you lose all your speed when you jump. So in order to get just the right position, we need to do a position setup in order to make sure there's exactly one frame, just one, where the jump works out at all, where the trick is possible. And then we catch the frame when we jump, and then we use the brush to advance twice, which is 4 frames in total, to catch a specific one of 2 particular frames during the start of our jump, where we have just enough jump height to make the trick. So the brush buffer, unlike pause buffering from Ocarina of Time, you can't use it to buffer button presses. You can only use it to buffer analog stick and button releases. And that's exactly what we do here. So we have to press the jump button frame perfectly, but we can use the brush buffer to help us release it at the right time. But like I said before, brush buffering only advances 2 frames at a time, which means it's still frame perfect technically. The brush buffer itself ends up being frame perfect. There I got it. That was actually quite a slow skip, which is good because it let me explain it, but it's bad in that I lost a bunch of time. That took about 2 minutes. My par, I would say, is about 1 minute 30 seconds for consistently getting it. So here's Evil Rao. So as it turns out, Rao this whole time is being impersonated. Little did we know, since we barely looked at her. She's been being impersonated by an evil spirit called Ninetails, which is why she's dressed up in a furry costume right now. And she attacks us here, but being both a canine and a human, she's extraordinarily vulnerable to explosives. Especially those powered by Steel Fisake. And then one last time, we must cross the lava, thankfully this being much easier than crossing it forward. We don't even need a buffer. Unfortunately, I actually messed it up here. I do say it's a lot easier, but that's a relative term. It's still a decently hard trick to get the jump timing just right, because you can still miss it in the same way, where you hit the ceiling, or you don't jump high enough, or something like that. So anyway, now that we've defeated Evil Rao, unfortunately before we were able to make it there, since I guess we took a bit too long doing Fire Tablet Skip, Rao had the time to kill Queen Himiko. The Queen Himiko, with her not exactly dying breath, I guess her first Force Ghost's dying breath, revealed to us the location of Evil Rao's secret clubhouse, which happens to be our next dungeon. Yay! So there you can see Rao is gone because she disappeared. She took off the mask by putting on the mask. Haha. And yeah, now we need to go chase after her since she's really evil, and we need to, we can't just let evil stand, being the great goddess Amaterasu. So yeah, we're just running through. Everyone is still afflicted by this horrible plague. Everyone is still dying. But this guy, he's running his shop. Once again, a familiar sight. People continuing to operate their business despite there being a plague ongoing. And this guy's actually just fine. He seems unaffected, and he's perfectly willing to sell us weapons of mass destruction. I actually purposely hit the save mirror trigger here. That's just to heal. Anytime you go into a save mirror, you automatically get your health and ink restored. But we cannot save in this run. This is something I could have explained much earlier in the run, however, now that I have time. This game is timed by in-game time, and it must be single segment. The reason for that is because if you save and load a save, unlike in most Zelda games where like save and quit doesn't actually lose you progress, like when you load a save, you can sort of just return to a save make and return to a save at any time, and then you don't lose any progress, and you can abuse that to like leave dungeons and stuff. In this game, when you save, if you like return to the save or if you die or something, you lose all of your progress until your last, or since your last save. We actually have to do this fight skip again since we skipped it earlier, so the trigger's still there. Anyway, so if we were to load a save, it would reset not only our progress but our in-game timer as well, which would make the run no longer single segment. So as a result, we have to ban making and loading saves during the run. Here, Otohime decides to become a long boy like her ex-husband, and she does this expressly just to become a bridge. She transforms into a bridge, and this gets us finally into Oni Island, the next major dungeon and the second to last. Right off the bat, we're supposed to have both in the Inferno ability and Fire Tablet to get through here. But it's just barely possible to make this jump. Unfortunately, I missed it a few times here. The first time you miss it is the worst because it has this cutscene. But it's just barely possible to jump off of Arahime's forehead and make it onto that ledge there. But the timing is quite strict. This is one of those tricks that I really wish I'd practiced more before this run. Because it's the kind of skip that you feel quite consistent at for a while until you miss it in a run. Because it's not really that hard, but the timing is kind of abstract, so if you lose the feel for it, then you miss it a bunch of times in a row. Because you have to jump at the right time and air tackle at the right time to make it. Anyway, now that we've done that, we have skipped the last requirement for the Fire Tablet. And we can actually, right away, yet again, do a major sequence break. We can skip out of bounds here by just barely being able to make it over this invisible wall. And then rather than going through the entire first floor of the dungeon, we can go all the way around the exterior of this huge volcano here that makes up the dungeon. And quite conveniently for us, at the halfway through the dungeon, there happens to be an outside portion on the other side of the volcano. And even more fortunately, that portion happens to be loaded at the same time as this one. Which means that by doing a bunch of very, by repeatedly jumping to avoid slipping all the way into the water, we can make it all the way across the backside and get to this statue here. And then from out of bounds, we can restore it. And that loads us back inbounds. And this is actually how we get our next brush technique. This gets us Thunderstorm, which is the equivalent of Water Spout, but for electricity. Which is a hard requirement to beat the game. The tutorial is here kind of weird. We have to wait for this cycle on the thunder in order to use it. If we brush too early, Isun will actually get mad at us for, messing up the tutorial. It's weird. Another fun fact, rotating bridges appear in a few places in this dungeon, and you can always jump through the underside of a rotating bridge. You'll always just pop up to the top, which is quite convenient. And now we're halfway through at least the first floor of this dungeon. Just skipped a huge segment where we have to do like a bunch of, like a huge labyrinth where we race a character named Toby, who's actually like a piece of paper. He's a sentient prayer slip. But he wants to race us a bunch, and we have to race him and beat him through this like big obstacle course. But we do not do that, because that would be slow. Here, this is the introduction of electric keys. When you are holding one in your mouth, these electric platforms become solid under you. And this is a cute gimmick. And we're going to be abusing that in a couple places. It also acts as a source of electricity for Thunderstorm. Here we skip a fight. This is one of those just run around it kind of skips. No fancy trickery involved. And here's a paper maze. A paper door maze. It looks really cool just being able to run through it, but it's always the same pattern. I mess up Cherry Bomb a bunch here. It's painful to watch back. This is unfortunately one of the fight triggers we just can't run through. It's way too big. And just one exorcism slip is enough to take these guys out. I tried to do their floral finisher there, because their floral finisher death animation is really fast. But I accidentally hit the trigger for the thunder from the key in my mouth, and so I got the wrong brush power. I got Thunderstorm instead of Gale Storm. And then we deposit the electric key, and here we hit this trigger from behind a cutscene trigger, which skips that cutscene. So normally you're supposed to get a cutscene where the camera pans over this big statue, and then you blow it up. But we just blow it up first. And then the other trigger disappears. And here is a trap. We have to power slash all 5 of these eye switches before the lava rises up. Oh no, it's very slow. So here we abuse the R3 button, where you press in the right stick. When you do this, the camera snaps behind Ami. One sort of weird thing about this game is that panning the camera around is extremely slow. The camera just is so sluggish when you want to turn it. But using R3, we can make it turn very quickly, which helps us get that last eye switch there. And there's a couple times in this game where I've been abusing that in various ways. Here we're sort of locked into a cycle, so this fancy movement I'm doing doesn't actually matter. We have to wait for this bridge to rotate a certain amount. And there's just no way to beat this cycle in this category. So we're going to jump off of this spiky bridge, which doesn't hurt us as long as we jump off it fast enough. And then we have to grab this key, and then we jump all the way back down. And the movement here is really awkward, because normally when you fall, Ami has this landing animation, but we can cancel it by jumping. So yeah, we barely beat the cycle there to fall over the final, or that spiky bridge. Normally we'd have to go under it, but we can just barely get there fast enough. And then we can skip actually jumping on these things by doing a very awkward air tackle. And then this is another cycle-based thing. This side-scroller segment is just full of cycles. We have to jump through these gates on these progressively faster spinning discs. And we can power slash them to make them stop. This is something, it's a very secret knowledge. The game does not tell you about this at all, and you don't see that hazard anywhere else, so there's no opportunity to use it elsewhere. But power slashing there just makes it easier to do it. This is Oni Island Floor 4. This is actually one of my favorite segments in the run. We start by doing this cutscene skip, by jumping around here. Then we get here, and then we abuse a quirk of the first-person camera in order to turn it around instantly so that we can get this vine really quickly. And then we're going to basically skip the entire floor here. We do yet another brush adventure, and this is the only time where we clip through a wall with the brush. We do a setup there to make it clip every time. We blow up the cherry bomb from the other side, because that wall is only detonatable from one side, which is the reverse side. And then we make it all the way to the end dungeon. This is Toby. This is the character we've been supposed to be racing this whole time. But we skip every single race except for his very last one. We skip his entire character arc, where he, at the very end, gracefully sacrifices himself for our benefit. But instead he just dies, so yeah, rip Toby. And that brings us to the end of the dungeon. So here's one of the more interesting boss fights in the game. This is actually only the second one that we've done. So we start with a constellation, because Ninetails, part of Ninetails' whole character is that she sees herself a god. A false god, an evil god. But we can just blow her up. So she doesn't take damage from that, but it does aggro her, and that makes her vulnerable to Thunderstorm, which makes her function sort of like Jalhala from Wind Waker, if you've played that game. She explodes into 4 spirits, and we can just take them all out with a couple of exorcism slips. And then each of them drops a little bit of money, which is actually important. We want to pick up all of that money, or at least as much of it as we can, quickly, before the second cycle, because there's 9 spirits in total, because she's Ninetails. And for the second one, there's actually, all of the spirits are vulnerable to just 1 exorcism slip, except for 1, which has a bit more health. So we just power slash that last spirit, rather than using 2 exorcism slips. And that saves an exorcism slip, which makes the yen run a bit easier. And then now we're already down to the final phase of Ninetails, which is finally directly vulnerable to explosives. So we just use 4 exorcism slips, and she's down. And that is Ninetails. It gives us a bunch of money. Asks us to save, but we do not, because, again, we're not allowed to save. One interesting thing is, unfortunately with this version of the game, the only instability in it, the only like kind of random crashes that can happen, is if you leave the save dialog, whether you save or not, whenever you leave the save screen, there's a small chance that it will randomly crash. And we have no idea why this happens, but I have actually lost a run to this, to accidentally hitting the yes dialog to save after a boss, and then I realized, don't save, immediately close the save dialog, and it crashed. So fortunately that has not happened ever since, but I've been very mindful never to accidentally open the save dialog in runs. Fortunately, if you do save, it does save properly. Like your save doesn't get corrupted or anything. Anyway, after having defeated all of the evil in the sort of southern end of Japan, we now have to return all the way to where we started to go slay evil in the north end of Japan. In Hokkaido would be the analogous real-life location. If it wasn't already obvious, all of these locations are sort of supposed to stand in a mythical sense for the actual locations of real-world Japan. Actual battles that happened in ancient Japan. And this one, they all have fancy names based on like Shinto gods. Here's another one of those times where we jam the camera into the floor to get it close enough to hit this thunderstorm trigger from before a big camera pan cutscene trigger. So yeah, quite simple. And this finally brings us to the last of the 3 major arcs of this game. There's everything up to defeating Orochi, and then everything up to defeating Ninetails, who's sort of the secondary big bad. She's the source of all the problems in like Saeon, or most of the problems in Saeon, and North Ryoshima and such. And then finally we come to the final place riddled with evil, which is the very snowy land of, not Hokkaido, but Kamui. And very fortunately, and quite hilariously, Kamui is probably the most broken part of the game. We're going to start here by completely skipping the challenge, like every single roadblock in the first area. We do by far the biggest brush adventure in the whole game. We really stretch out the camera here, and bring it out of bounds. We bring it over the cliff and underneath the floor, underground, because guess what? The next Guardian Sapling is underneath a mountain that we're supposed to blow up with an electric arrow. Yes, really. But we can actually get the camera underneath the mountain using this giant brush adventure, which actually mess up a bit here. This is actually slower than it's supposed to be. So I accidentally go too low, which brings me out of the range of the sapling. and then I have to drag the camera up a bit, and then I can finally bloom it. And it looks a bit glitchy here since the mountain's still there when it's not supposed to be. But yes, that skips that saves about a minute doing that. It skips meeting a character that we're going to see much later called Oki, who actually has a huge character arc over this whole segment of the game, and we're going to skip all of it. Then here we're going to do a big thing to skip a scripted fight with an enemy called an igloo turtle. This is actually one of the most poorly understood tricks, or it was until about a few weeks ago when I finally figured out like 80% or like 90% of all the mechanics that go into this. Basically, we activate this flower, which is it's a really complicated thing for the conditions to activate it. But we can then vine to it, and that clips us through a bunch of geometry, which lets us skip past the the enormous igloo turtle fight trigger. And then finally, we are going to make one of our last shopping trips of the game. We're going to stock up on 2 items called Inkfinity Stones. This is an item that we could have obtained much earlier, but we haven't had a need for it yet. Infinity Stones basically give you unlimited ink for a minute, a limited period of time, which is going to be quite handy coming up soon, because there's going to be a couple segments where we need to use a lot of brush techniques that consume a lot of ink in quick succession. Up till now, we've been able to work around our limited ink supply by using ink upgrades with praise, because whenever you upgrade your ink, it also refills it. So now we're in Wep'keer. So Wep'keer is the village of Kamui. It is afflicted by a terrible blizzard, and we're meant to sort of talk to the people of the Oina tribe here in order to help them out, and then they open the gate at the back to let us through. But we're just not going to help them, because helping people is not good when it takes time. We have a lord of evil, of all evil, to defeat, and these guys are not a requirement. So they can solve their own problems, I'm sure. So we're going to do this huge out of bounds thing, where we're just barely able to jump onto some out of bounds collision that they forgot to put an invisible wall in front of. Then we can climb over this like invisible slope here that's underneath the visible collision. And then here's one of the only times we clip through geometry here. There's an acute enough angle where we can pop down through the wall and behind the gate. And that saves about a minute as well, or maybe closer to 45 seconds of talking to all of the people in Wep'keer. And that brings us to this last area here, which is Ezafuji. And this is just a bit of downtime. We have to climb all the way up this path, this is one of the biggest areas in the game, because there's a huge thing in the center of it that we're not looking at, because we're not on a road trip here, we're on a speedrun. But there's a huge ship, and it takes up a bunch of space, so the rest of the area is made bigger to compensate. Now, coming up here, we have our final dungeon. Normally, to get to this next dungeon, the devs intended for us to go on this huge quest, where we go all the way back to Kamui, through this giant forest obstacle course, to another village. We talk to some people in that village, and then we go back in time 100 years. We have to fight a bunch of enemies, including a boss, which is a really long boss fight, by the way. But as it turns out, the dungeon is here. The dungeon is already here. And the only thing stopping us is this gate that's in front of us. And very conveniently, there's a flower here, which we can do a trick to get us a bunch of height, which lets us jump over an invisible wall, get out of bounds behind the gate's collision, and we can just jump into the loading zone. And this is Waka Shrine. Welcome. That trick saves 30 minutes. It is massive, and it's not that hard. It's like we had City Checkpoint, which saved 25 minutes. We had Fire Tablet Skip, which saves 20 minutes. This saves 30 minutes, and it's nowhere close to as hard as those, which is beautiful. Absolutely lovely. So here this brings us to Waka Shrine. So in this first floor here, we're supposed to do a puzzle in order to get a key to get through this lockjaw. But we can yet again do a brush adventure. And this one's interesting. So this is ice that we have to melt. Now we got Fireburst earlier to replace Inferno as our fire power to melt things with. One of the downsides of Inferno is that it's much more short, Fireburst is that it's much more short range than Inferno. which means we have to sort of stretch the camera to get it close enough to the ice, which I do quite slowly here. It's actually supposed to go a lot faster than this. But I managed to get it. I draw a big infinity symbol, which is the symbol for Fireburst, and that melts the ice, and that warps us through the locked door. This is one of the only times where we can abuse cutscene warps in an effective way. However, one downside to this, the puzzle that you do to get the key for that door, if you do not do it, the game will hard crash when we defeat the mid-boss, so keep that in mind. Obviously, we would not like it to crash, so either we're going to do that puzzle later, or we are going to do something else, and you'll see. Here we actually have to do a bunch of clever things to avoid losing our dash all the way through that segment. This is the same dash that I had from the very beginning of the dungeon. I have not lost it, so it makes running up that spiral staircase, or that spiral path, much easier while these cannons are firing at you. Once again, here we jump over a blue scroll in order to avoid its aggro range, which saves a bunch of time of having to run around it. These are fire spiders. It's kind of complicated. They're a counterpart to another environmental hazard introduced much earlier in the game. But yeah, they hit you, they hurt. This is a Great Tengu. This is no longer a Great Tengu. It is a pretty lame Tengu, if you ask me. Here we're actually going to do something interesting. We jam ourselves against the battle barrier, and then we use first-person camera to get the camera just close enough that we can use Fireburst to melt that lever without heading into a cutscene trigger, which is directly in front of us. This lets us hit the lever in order to stop these gears in the right position. There's a puzzle to figure out what the right position actually is, and then you're supposed to have that ability that we skipped earlier, Veil of Mist, that lets you slow down time in order to be able to react to the gears spinning to when they hit the right location so that you can hit the lever on time. But we can just keep on brushing until we see the gear in the right space. And doing all of that, doing that weird slot machine thing, that gets us our final brush technique, Blizzard. And this is water spout but for ice. One interesting side effect of getting this technique is that the weapon on our back has changed. It gives us a new weapon called Solar Flare, which is supposed to be sort of the effect of getting all 13 brush techniques. But it gives it to us even though we only got 10 of them. We skipped 3. Here we actually are going to do a major skip. We are going to skip half of Waka Shrine, pretty much the entire rest of it. This skip is fairly hard. This is one of the harder skips in the run. And it's called Nechku skip, because guess what? Nechku is the mid-boss, and the reason we are not going to crash is because we are just not going to fight the mid-boss, so we're never going to defeat the mid-bosses, which is what would crash. So doing that whole sequence where we like jump over an invisible wall and then climb along a slippery slope, that gets us all the way here to the cannon room. The cannon room is a bit of a tough one, because this is one of the rooms where you're supposed to have both of the towers that we skipped, Inferno and Veil of Mist, or well, 2 of them anyway. But as it turns out, one side benefit of Fireburst is that not only can it melt things like Inferno, it can also slow down time. Yeah, for real, it can slow down. I have no idea why the devs added this, but yes. Inferno, or Fireburst, as well as another ability that we technically got, but is harder to draw, which I won't explain here. Basically, this slows down time. What we have to do is we have to reflect the pink shots from that gold cannon. The reason why we're supposed to have Inferno here is because there's these red cannons also shooting at us, and we don't destroy them by reflecting shots, we destroy them by lighting cannons on the other side of the gap. So, because we don't have Inferno, Fireburst doesn't actually work to activate those cannons, so we just have to deal with all the red cannons firing at us at once. And I actually almost died here, because I kept getting hit, because I kept messing up the trick to get Fireburst to work with reflecting the gold cannon shots. And then here we're intended to do another ball pushing puzzle, the last ball pushing puzzle. But we can actually just do a bunch of platforming. We're supposed to push a ball made of solid ice here so that we can freeze these hot gears in place. But we can just avoid jumping on them entirely. And we can get this key. It's a very nice skip. Very cool looking. And that is the final lockjaw. And then way earlier, at the very beginning of Kamui, which wasn't really that long ago now, we did a trick called Oki Skip, and this is Oki. He's just chilling here. You know, we've never met, we've never seen this guy before, but he's just chilling here. And he just, you know, activates this elevator. That's all he does. He's supposed to have this entire character arc over this entire third segment of the story. But instead, we just show up at the end, and instead of him helping us fight this final boss like we're supposed to, we literally just use 5 exorcism slips. This is by far the cheesiest boss fight in the entire game. I have no idea why, but the devs forgot to give this boss any type of invulnerability to exorcism slips. So you can just take them out with 5. Rapid fire. And this raises the Ark of Yamato, the final dungeon in the game. It's not really a dungeon. It's actually... we'll get into it in a minute, but it's actually a boss rush, which is quite interesting. So just some scenic running up a rainbow bridge. So the thing with the Ark of Yamato is that this is basically supposed to be the origin of all evil in ancient Japan. And the people here are the Celestials. They are the people of the Celestial Plane who are now spirits who were killed on the Ark of Yamato, escaping from evil on the Celestial Plane. So, again, this is a boss rush. There's 5 bosses here. There's actually 6 bosses in the game. But the one we just fought, Lechku and Nechku, we just fought them, so I guess the devs didn't want to put that boss fight right away in the boss rush that you do right after the dungeon. This first boss is actually one of the ones we skipped. This is Blight. He is the source of the plague in Saeon, so it's very nice of him that he would come out to here and just stop doing that. Interestingly, he's supposed to be made vulnerable by Veil of Mist, one of the powers that we skipped. But extremely lucky, he is actually, it's possible to make him vulnerable with his second attack here. So we just stall until he does it. And then I do an interesting technique where I jump cancel my standard attack combo in order to get more hits in so that we can one-cycle him. Otherwise he would turn invincible and we'd have to wait for him to do the spinny sword attack again. These warps are kind of interesting as well. Here there's going to be another trigger with the Celestial. We saw this coming in, but I didn't mention it. After every other boss fight in the Ark, this one Celestial will talk to you and give you a bunch of backstory. But I already explained the gist of it. And here's the big bad from the very first arc of the story, Orochi, who we skipped entirely. We're actually we're supposed to have already fought him twice. So this is his second form, the true Orochi, but it's very similar to the first one, just has more health. And this is actually by far the most complicated boss fight in the entire game, like seriously. We just don't have a way to cheese this, and there's a bunch of steps in the sequence in order to actually defeat him, because he has 8 heads, which complicates things quite a lot. So we start with this interesting movement pattern in order to make these 3 heads rage at us at once. And that lets us use Water Spout to put the sake that's in the floor into their mouths, which makes them a little bit drunk. But to get them completely drunk, we have to repeat the process. So this is the triple head strategy for phase 1 of Orochi. The earth, poison, and light heads. We have to both, while doing this, we have to avoid their heads and their attacks and use Water Spout. There we can break the bell on its back to end phase 1. I actually hit it with the last Water Spout at the same time as I hit all the other 3 heads, which is very handy. And then the second phase is actually a lot more iterative than the first one. We have to hit each of these heads with 1 Water Spout, and to do that we have to make them roar, and each of them happens to have a standard attack that we can make them do by... we can manipulate them to do this by standing directly underneath them. We can get up to 4 heads drunk at a time before heads start getting, like, shaking off the alcohol. And then once we have 4 done, which is half of them, we use 2 exorcism slips to take them all out at once. So that's earth or fire through light, and then there's lightning, water. Each of these heads has an element associated with it, which gives them some unique attacks, but we just don't give them a chance to do it. One interesting thing here is I actually messed this up. There's fire you can see falling from the ceiling randomly. This is very bad because we do not have the fire tablet, which is supposed to make you immune to fire damage. So there's a very real risk of dying just by burning to death, which would be very bad. However, if you get hit by the fire falling from the ceiling, you can stop burning by doing a standard attack. Unfortunately, what happened there is I accidentally did the standard attack at the same time that Orochi head did its attack. And if you... this is something you're not really supposed to do easily, at least not unintentionally, but if you hit the Orochi head while it's doing its attack, it cancels its attack and it sort of recoils, and then it gets angry, and instead of roaring, it does this like thrash attack, which lasts forever. And you have to wait for it to do yet another attack before you can get it drunk and actually kill it, which is such a pain. So that lost me a bunch of time in this fight, because I just got super unlucky where I knew I was on fire, I didn't want to die, and I accidentally attacked at just the wrong moment, which made me have to get 2 extra heads drunk. But fortunately we made that through. We made it through that just fine. We didn't lose too much time, and we were able to continue this run. I haven't really mentioned this up till now, but technically dying wouldn't end the run right now, because we have an item called the Astral Pouch, which we got at the very beginning of the game, which is an extra life. It's an item that you're not allowed to skip, but you don't actually get an extra life until you fill it with 100 units of food, or 200 units of food actually. And the only reason we ever do that is because it happens to be that when we get Fire Burst, the guy, the cook in the restaurant, gives us a bunch of food that happens to total up to over 200 units. And that food also actually contains 26,000 yen for some reason. This is the Spider Queen. Very easy. The same as the first time, except it takes 3 vines instead of 2 to make her vulnerable. But then we can just use 2 exorcism slips, and she goes down. Sorry for my creaky chair. So, a long time ago when we left Gale Shrine, I said that we'd be ignoring Crimson Helm, not quite forever, but almost. And as it turns out, Crimson Helm decided he was tired of waiting for us to, finish his dungeon. And he decided to trek all the way up here to Kamui and fight us on the Ark. So Crimson Helm, in reality, is a bit of a weird looking guy. He's kind of like a 6-legged horse, but he's also got arms, he's got 2 swords. Very, very strange looking guy. The strategy to defeat him is quite simple. He has this armor before he can be made vulnerable, and then he has fire armor underneath that, which you have to use Gale Storm to blow away. It's actually one of the required uses of Gale Storm. And then you can just destroy him with 4 exorcism slips, and he keels over and dies without a chance to do anything, because all of that stuff happens instantly. One interesting thing about these warps that pops up at the end of every fight, if you are inside where the blue warp spawns when the fight ends, and they spawn in the same place every time, so you can do that. The warp doesn't actually work right away, so you actually want to wait right at the edge of the blue warps rather than inside them, because if you were inside them, you would have to leave the blue warp and then go back into it to make it work. Very annoying. That should be fixed. Please patch. And then finally, this brings us back to the last boss that we have fought before. We've only fought 2 out of the 5 bosses in this boss rush, but here we are with the final one out of the 5. This is Ninetails. Ark Ninetails is very, very similar to Ninetails in the Oni Island. We start with a cherry bomb, makes it vulnerable. She comes up and screams at us. We use Thunderstorm. She explodes like Chalhala. We use 2 exorcism slips. Except, actually, I tried to conserve them here, I remember. Because I was worried from having messed up the yen route on one of the fights. I thought I might not have enough yen. So I purposely conserved a slip here just to be safe. Oh yeah, because, sorry, to explain that properly. It's because I messed up Orochi and I had to use 2 extra exorcism slips. I was worried that I wouldn't have enough. That's why I wanted to save 1 exorcism slip on this fight. And I was also very careful to pick up all of the yen that the spirits drop here, because it adds up to a lot of extra yen that you get compared to just defeating Ninetails by itself. There's some convenient marks on the floor here that make it a lot easier than normal to line up Ami relative to the blue warp. So you can see I'm quite close there. And we just tackle into it. And with the entire boss rush complete, we now have not only enough yen, but the entire dungeon complete. And the final warp to the final boss is open. But rather than jumping right into it, we have some shopping to do. Because guess what? The final boss of this game is in fact a bit vulnerable to exorcism slips. In fact, it's very vulnerable to exorcism slips. It's so vulnerable to exorcism slips that it's all we buy. We buy 43 of them. I think this is more than we use in the entire rest of the run combined. we just max it out. You hold up, you do that shopping, you scroll down to the exorcism slips, you hold up to max them out, and then you just press A twice, and you leave. And this brings us to the final boss, the origin of all evil in Japan. This is Yami, and as you can see, Yami is quite spherical. And for that reason, I like to call Yami the final ball-pushing puzzle of the game. After the one we do in the very beginning, that ball has decided to come back for revenge. And I just waste a bit of time here by spamming the brush. There's no point in that. Yami, in reality, functions as sort of an auto-scroller. Basically, at the start of the fight, Yami takes away all of our brush techniques, and then we have to repeatedly hit it to make it give us back all of our brush techniques. We have to wring them out of him. And because we're just using exorcism slips and a couple other things when required, we basically do the fight as fast as can possibly be done, and we're really just waiting between each cutscene of it giving us back a brush power. So overall, this fight goes on. This fight has 5 phases in total, and each one of them is basically amounts to use some exorcism slips, get a brush power, use some exorcism slips, get a brush power. Interestingly, if you remember, we skipped a bunch of brush powers. When you get them back in this fight, you actually do get the brush powers that you skipped, and you can use them. They're just completely useless in the fight, because we have better things to do than to actually fight Yami the intended way. So here, I have to wait for it to use Water Spout, and then I can use an Exorcism Slip. And this gives us the final brush power of this phase. It's the same order each time. So if you recognize the icon for that orb that comes out, you can actually see which brush powers you're going to get. And that ends phase 2. Phase 3 is actually probably the most interesting one. Rather than using exorcism slips between each brush power, we use them all at the start. We use 5 because this phase of Yami is a slot machine. So we can rig the slots, so to speak, so that it always gives us a new brush power. This is one of those cases where an enemy will actually move while we have the brush open. Yami in that specific animation isn't frozen by the brush, unlike everything else, which we can use to prepare our power slash for the instant that all 3 slots start spinning, so that we can get the brush power as soon as possible. Here I actually get hit by the fire. This is one of the only times Yami gets a clean chance to hit us. But obviously there's little risk of dying. Anyway, since the rest of this is sort of an auto-scroller, I'll let it speak for itself. And I'd like to take the time to thank a bunch of people who have made this run possible. I want to start by thanking all of the people, or a bunch of the people who welcomed me into the community when I first joined around 10 months ago, closing in on a year now. So that would be, in no particular order, Sinri, Skyryon, Cinderdog, Cornchunks, Dedang, Sudadang, Liriati, and Kaiserado. Some of those names you might actually recognize. All very helpful people in the Okami speedrunning Discord, who you can find linked in the description. All kind souls who have helped me learn this game. I want to thank Critical Sid, who was the world record holder of this category when I started running. He was very helpful and informative for some of the hardest tricks that were known at the time. I want to thank Kinnan. He's never held the world record, or he hasn't held the world record in this category since I started running it. But he runs a bunch of other categories. He holds world records in a few of them. And he's just very wholesome, very encouraging. One of the most knowledgeable people in the community about the game as a whole, because he has run every category. I want to thank Tsunakan, who was the Japanese runner who I initially took the world record from. He's kind of one of those people who has pushed the game the hardest. He has done the things that many other people have considered impossible. He's discovered some of the most important skips in the run, like City Checkpoint Skip and Early Fireburst. And he's just been an inspiration to really push the game harder than anyone else. I want to thank Giant Cookie Jar, who really revolutionized the game in the couple months he was running. He discovered like 10 minutes of skips. It's kind of ridiculous. And this was after a bunch of other things were already known. He was just such an efficient glitch hunter. And I hope to see him return someday. But I wish him the best of luck, whatever he chooses to do. And finally, before we finally defeat Yami with this barrage of 12 exorcism slips, yes, 12, I want to thank Krinotider for being a fantastic friend and rival throughout this final leg of my journey. He was the most competitive runner with me at the very end. He actually took the world record from me not too long ago, and I was able to take it back, but I really hope I have the opportunity to take it back again. So, thank you all for watching Okami New Game Any Percent in 2 hours, 21 minutes, and 20 seconds. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments on Twitter or in the Okami Speedrunning Discord, all of which are linked below in the description, or on Twitter, also linked below. And thank you. If anyone would like to run this category, I know I said a lot of these tricks are insanely hard, but very fortunately, we have a beginner's route which omits the very hardest tricks, and only includes the kinds of tricks that you could learn as you get to them within like half an hour or so. So the beginner route, we have both a video guide and a text guide, which again you can find through the Okami Speedrunning Discord. There's a lot of resources and a lot of friendly people there who are willing to help anyone who would like to learn. Again, when I first started, I started on the beginner's route, and I worked up from there. So I really think anyone can do it. If you would like to run any of the other categories, we also have information on any of those. And yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. This has been such a journey, and I hope only that I can journey even further with all of my friends in the community and any of you that would like to join along. Ciao.